Hey students, this is Mr. Moore with your week 17 government notes. And to be truthful, this is the last week of notes. First semester has 18 weeks in it, but the last week is finals week. So I'm not going to attempt to teach you new things during week 18, but merely review what we've already learned. In this class, what I've tried to do is to cover some of the most essential documents in the United States government. And the two most important documents are the Declaration of Independence, which really gave birth to our country, signed on July 4th of 1776, and kind of outlines what we believe as Americans to be the purpose of government. The second document that's really significant in our country is called the Constitution. It is made up of 7 articles. Each article covers a restriction on what the federal government can do, how the states should interact, the 3 branches of government, and a reminder of how we can change or add to the Constitution. It's not an easy process, but it is possible. And because of that, there are now, presently in 2020, there are 27 amendments to the Constitution. The first 10 are called the Bill of Rights. So, in a lot of ways, the Bill of Rights is a part of the Constitution. Some people see it as something separate and different, and maybe that's true. It's the first 10 amendments, the first 10 out of 27 amendments that have been added to the Constitution. And so that's what I've been trying to do in this class. We've taken time to cover the 3 branches of government, both the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, covering what they're called, what they do, how they function. And of course, we've gone over, the Bill of Rights extensively, and we've talked about the role that media plays, how federalism works, and we really tried to do a great job of helping us understand the United States government. What we do this last week is we try to take what we already know about U.S. government and compare it to some governments around the world, trying to look at the different types of governments that exist in the world. And then we also, of course, look at some international organizations that are, multi, state governments, organizations, specifically the UN. Is one of the things we're going to look at. That's kind of a multinational governmental organization. There's also one called the European Union, but we're not going to focus on that one too much in this class. But that's the last piece, is to try to look at comparative governments. Sometimes when we look at how things work in other places, it can help us understand our own country and how we function, maybe how we could do things differently, and even different approaches to how things are done. So, what are the different ways of running a country? Some people say that there are 8 types of governments. Okay, but as you can clearly see, I've divided those 8 even into, broken it down into even more finite ways of looking at it. So maybe the simplest way to look at it is democracy. There is a system of government which is called democracy, where everybody has a voice and everybody has the ability to participate in government. Now, sometimes countries use democratic principles and use pieces of democracy, but I think it's really important that we understand that the United States is not a democracy. I know that's weird because you kind of grow up thinking that as a student. The truth is, the United States is a republic. We in the United States choose representatives to make the decisions for us. In 2020, we had an election in November. And in that election, we, the people, got to vote for who was going to be president of the United States for the next 4 years. But the truth is, we didn't. We actually didn't get to vote for who was president. What we got to choose was how our electors should vote. So I know it sounds kind of weird, but in California, we have 55 electoral votes. And so the citizens of California get to cast their vote or their opinions on how we should use those 55 votes. And in California, as in most states, it's a winner take all. Now, in California, we also got to vote on who should be in the House of Representatives from the different congressional districts. And in California, we also got to vote on some ballot measures and some propositions. Now, in that case, it is direct democracy. Maybe we are doing some democracy in the United States. So I don't want to confuse you, but our system is not a democracy, it's a republic. And there is a difference. Okay. Obviously, there are still some monarchies in the world where power is handed down from father to son. Sometimes the ladies are included in those dynastic sessions, but oftentimes it's handed down from father to son. There are some monarchies like Saudi Arabia today, still has a monarchy. Okay. And there are some constitutional monarchies, places like United Kingdom of Great Britain, right? They still have a queen, but they also have a parliament. So they are a constitutional monarchy. But that definitely is a system of government that's existed for, well, since civilization began. Okay. Maybe the Greeks came up with the first real democracy. That's what at least historians generally refer to. Monarchies can be found in almost every continent that was civilized, and almost every system and culture. Monarchies, republics. Well, there were some republics, like the Republic of Rome back in ancient times. In medieval times, there might have been something like the Republic of Venice, although maybe it was more of an oligarchy. But anyways, there are some republics that were born recently, like the United States. Our country is just, 240 some years in 2020, right? And of course, maybe the other famous republic in history is the French Republic, right? The French Revolution. Now, there are a lot of countries that are totalitarian. These are, sometimes people will say totalitarian and dictator as the same thing, and they can be. A dictator is when one person is really running the show. And you might say, well, how is that different than a monarchy? And in a lot of ways, it's not different. But a monarchy is more hereditary, whereas a dictator, usually it's a self-made person who seized power and took control. A totalitarian state could be a dictatorship, but it's where the government has total and absolute control. There are two sides of the radical, sides of the political spectrum. If we go to the right too far, we get into fascist states where the state seizes control, nationalizes things. It's extremely radical right. And if you go too far to the extreme on the left, again, they almost act alike. On the far left, we have communism, where again, under theoretical communism, there is no government, right? The workers control everything. It's a workers' paradise, theoretically. In practicality, the way it's been implemented in places like North Korea, in the Soviet Union during the Cold War, or in China, is that the government runs everything and controls the economy. An oligarchy is when a few people have the ruling power. Some people claim that even places like the United States have become more of an oligarchy, as there are a few people who have the wealth and the power in government and in the economy. But anyways, this is a little look. There are other types of governments, like a theocracy, where it's led by like religious leaders, and there's other words we use like a tyranny, right? Or a junta, like a coalition of a military that's kind of leading things. So there are different ways to take this and break it down. There's even the absence of government, like anarchy. But I think this is a great place to start at the end of this last week of notes to remind us of the different types of government. Again, I will repeat that the United States is a republic. That is, we the people of the United States get to choose leaders who represent us. And those chosen leaders are the ones who make the laws. It should only be the legislative branch that makes laws. The executive branch, its job is to enforce the laws or execute the laws, and is the rights of the judicial branch to review the law and see if it's constitutional. It is not okay for the courts to make laws. It's not okay for the executive branch to do executive orders. I got air quotes going on here. That we have separated the powers of our government on purpose. Now, let's talk about the United Nations for a little while. The United Nations is an organization where representatives from governments around the world meet together to try to find a solution to things in a peaceable way. After World War I, the Allies established an organization known as the League of Nations in the 1920s. The United States at the time was one of the countries that really promoted the League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson, when he went to Europe and they were working on the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, Woodrow Wilson, our 28th president, was pushing for the League of Nations. The problem is the president doesn't have the power to enact this, right? Congress does. And so when he went back, Congress was not in the mood to back the president. And so, ironically, even though the United States pushed for the League of Nations, the United States did not join, and thus the League of Nations never worked. It fell apart, and thus we found ourselves in World War II. After World War II, the UN was formed to allow for a place to discuss issues and prevent another global conflict. Very important during the Cold War and in modern issues. So the United Nations was formed after World War II, and the winners of World War II have a seat, a permanent seat on the Security Council. We're going to talk about that here in a few minutes. So the winners of World War II still run the world, financially and politically. Okay, the UN headquarters is in New York City. It was one place that was not devastated and blown up and destroyed after World War II. And the United States came away from World War II as a winning power, but we didn't suffer that much. Now, I don't mean to discredit those who died serving our country, but compared to the other countries in World War II, the United States made off economically good. And as far as casualties, number of people who died or injured in war was significantly lower than most other major world powers. And so the United States was in a unique position at the end of World War II. And so UN headquarters was set up in New York City. So there's a complex, a building complex in New York City that's like international territory. And delegates from all around the world go to the UN and meet to discuss problems and try to resolve the issues, especially when you're dealing with countries, that have different amounts of influence. Okay. There are some other important locations that are associated with the United Nations. Switzerland is seen as the most neutral country on the planet Earth. The two biggest wars in the history of the world, World War I and World War II, took place in Europe and other places, but kind of focused on European powers that were fighting each other. And Switzerland, right in the middle of Europe, stayed out of both conflicts. And so Geneva is a city in Switzerland, and it's seen as one of the headquarters of the United Nations. There's also an international court of justice, sometimes called the World Court, that's in the Netherlands. It's right next to Germany and pretty close to France. It's the Dutch part of Europe, and in The Hague is where they have the International Court of Justice. And so that's another, maybe a focal point of the UN. Most countries have an ambassador to the UN. The head of the UN is the Security Council, and then they pick a secretary general who kind of runs, the whole organization and kind of acts like a speaker as far as like moving things. Not a president, doesn't have all power, but does have the control to move forward agenda items and get things moving on the floor when the entire council meets together. The Security Council is derived of the winners of World War II. They have a permanent seat. So you've got the United States and Russia, and then of course you've got Great Britain and France, and you have China. And those 5 have veto power on the Security Council. There's a few other seats on the Security Councils that rotate between other countries. So really, again, it's the winners of World War II who still really have full veto power in the UN. How much power should the UN have in the world versus a country's sovereignty? In other words, should a country be able to do what it wants within its own boundaries? Or should it be held accountable for like human rights violations or how it treats its peoples when it's within its own borders? And so this is some questions that are being asked. Some people don't like the UN because they don't want to give up their own country's sovereignty. A lot of Americans are like, hey, I don't want to give up power to a foreign entity, right? Or this ambiguous world government. But there are a lot of people who think that the UN is great and helped us prevent World War III. Remember, the Cold War was World War III that almost happened. Okay? Now, there are some military and political alliances that have formed since World War II. The most famous is NATO. That's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the countries here in blue are the countries who formed an alliance during the Cold War. During the Cold War, Russia was called the Soviet Union, and there's 15 other countries that were a part of the Soviet Union, and countries that were allied with the Soviet Union. So a giant chunk of the world formed what they called the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War, and we almost got ourselves into World War III. But again, the UN was used to kind of help diffuse these international confrontations as different countries have different agendas. Okay, there is a word or an acronym, GDP. It stands for Gross Domestic Product. And gross domestic product is how we rank how strong country economies are, how big they are. For instance, right now, the United States has the world's biggest economy or biggest GDP. China has the world's second biggest GDP, gross domestic product. So China has the world's second biggest economy. Japan would have the third. So countries that join NATO are supposed to spend a certain percentage of their GDP, right, on defense. And the idea was an attack on one of these countries is considered an attack on all of them. So all of them would back each other up. In the last, 20 years or so, there hasn't been a lot of need for NATO, or at least NATO has been in some ways kind of dissolving to a certain extent. It still exists, don't get me wrong, but there has been some debate on how NATO should be used. NATO was involved in Iraq and Afghanistan as far as like the war on terrorism. So NATO is still active and it's still relevant, but probably less relevant than it was during the Cold War years. From the end of World War II until the 1990s. Again, I used the word ambassador when I was talking about the UN. Remember that an ambassador is a diplomat sent by a country as its official representative to a foreign nation. And ambassadors work in an embassy or a consulate. There are some differences between embassies and consulates, but they basically serve the same purpose. If we were just to rewind for a second, the United States would set up an embassy in Moscow, Russia. That is, we have a building in Moscow that has like U.S. Marines that guard it, and Russia gives us that little piece of territory as if it's a little piece of our own country in Russia. It's an embassy. So an American citizen could go to the embassy and find Americans and like an official representative of the U.S. government in Russia. And at the same time, because Russia gives us a little piece of land in Moscow, then Russia gets a little piece in, like, say, Washington, D.C., for them to have an embassy or a consulate. And it's like a little piece of Russia inside the United States. So almost every country will do this. Some countries have multiple embassies. like China would have multiple embassies in the United States. Well, they might have like an embassy, say, in Washington, D.C., and have a consulate in say, San Francisco. But they could have multiple embassies or consulates in a country if it's big. A country like Costa Rica that's small might only have one embassy in our country, and we might just have one in theirs. But some of the major players would have multiple consulates. They might have one in Washington, D.C., and one in California, and one in Florida. They might spread it out depending on where it's needed. So those are a couple of keywords: diplomats and embassies. Also, passports are official recognition of citizenship, or which government knows that you're a citizen of their country. And then you could use that, of course, to go and to get into different countries. So if you want to cross from, say, the United States to Russia, you would have to have a passport to prove that you're an American citizen and that the U.S. government is giving you the right to travel somewhere else. At the same time, Russia would have to either give you or decline a visa. Now, we use the word visa as in credit cards. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a country's permission for you to enter. So if you are an American citizen and you have a passport, you can go into Canada with a passport, but you don't need a visa. Same thing with Mexico. As long as you have a passport, sometimes even just a driver's license, then you could cross over into Mexico because we're neighbors. Some countries don't require a visa. Like when I traveled to Australia, I have to have a passport, but I also had to get a visa from the Australian government telling them exactly how long I was going to stay. So there are different regulations. If you want to travel to China, to mainland China, you have to have a passport and you have to get an official visa from the Chinese government to go there. Unless you go to Hong Kong, like my family went to Hong Kong a couple years ago, back when travel was going and we weren't restricted from COVID-19. But we went to Hong Kong, and that the particular city of Hong Kong is a special part of China, and it doesn't require a visa, just a passport. So those are two different words, passports and visas. And again, when I say visa, I mean a government's officially inviting you to their country for a set amount of time. And there's different kinds of visas: work visas, tourist visas, business visas, all kinds of things. And that's how governments control international travel and such. Okay. In the United States, we have a presidential system. We've broken our government up into three branches. Most governments around the world are broken up into three branches. The other type or system of that's used around the world, as much as the presidential system, is called the parliamentary system. The United Kingdom, even places like Canada, places like India, the world's biggest democracy, I'm air quoting here. So there's presidential system, okay? And you can see there's a parliamentary and a presidential. The voters vote for a legislative branch, and the voters vote for a separate executive branch, okay? And that's how we do it in the United States, okay? We vote for people to go to Congress, the Senate, and the House, and then we vote for the executive branch, the president. In a parliamentary system, the voters choose the legislative branch by vote, and then the legislative branch chooses the executive officer, okay? The chief executive. So in the United Kingdom, people in the UK and Great Britain, they vote for Parliament, okay? MPs, members of Parliament, and then the MPs choose a PM, a Prime Minister, to act as the executive officer. So I think it's really interesting. The type of system can allow for more diverse variety of political ideas. Remember, in the United States, we have lots of different political parties, but just two main ones. And in other countries, they can have multiple political parties that still have a say. And in some ways, it's more democratic. In the United States, we kind of get locked into this either or. I either got to vote for Donald Trump or Joe Biden in the 2020 election. Now, there's other people on the ballot, but everybody knows they're not going to win. They're not going to have, it's like throwing your vote away in some ways. So the parliamentary system is a very unique way, and I think that's really good to understand there are different ways to do it. In some ways, I really do like the parliamentary system because usually there's more than just two political parties that are represented. And generally that means instead of just being offered, vanilla or chocolate, you could get strawberry. You can get a different flavor in there, and I like that about it. So there's all kinds of charts and different ideas, but the United States is a great example of a presidential system, and United Kingdom, Great Britain, is a great example of a parliamentary system. Um, Now, sometimes we have to look at places around the world and we have to ask ourselves what's going on in that country and why is the government failing and how is it not meeting the needs of the people. And before we go pointing our finger at other countries in this last election, we might want to point a finger at ourselves and kind of see, are we really enacting the voice of the people? Is our country really representative of what people want? And we've had some challenges to our own democratic system. Again, our country is a republic, but we use the process of democracy in order to make sure that people are being heard. So this question says, why have some revolutions been followed by purges of dissidents, mass arrests of political opponents, the murder of class enemies, and suppression of free speech, abolition of private property and tax on religious groups? It's interesting, and I don't want to speak too soon because in the month of December of 2020, the Electoral College will vote on who's going to be our next president. And when I'm recording this, I don't know the answer. And then, of course, in January of 2021, a month later, we're going to inaugurate a new president. And we'll see. It's always been a peaceful transfer of power in our country, and we hope it remains that. But we have examples around the world of chaos and disillusionment and people being angry and taking to the streets in violence, not just in history, but in modern times as well. I like this quote that civilization is only 3 missed meals from anarchy. As long as people have food on the table and they have the ability to feel safe and secure and like they're being heard and they have prospects to be able to provide, then generally, governments interacting with their, citizens, it functions well. But when that breaks down, it can get ugly pretty quick. Lots of times we look at the map of the world and we see these different colors. And what we have to remember is on a map like this is a political map of the world. It doesn't show physical things like mountains and rivers. What it's showing by color are political boundaries. That is government jurisdiction. The United States, the president of the United States only has authority within the geographic boundaries of the United States, 48 contiguous states and Alaska and Hawaii, along with some territories like Puerto Rico and out in the Pacific Ocean like Guam and places like that. Okay, so each government only has jurisdiction within its boundaries. So how do these countries interact with each other? And if I commit a crime in the United States, but then I leave the United States before I get arrested and I end up in China, could I still be arrested for that? Because if I broke the law in the United States, it's the law of the United States I broke, not in China. Some countries have agreements with each other where they'll deport people back to the country of origin. It's called extradition. But some countries won't do it. Like China will not extradite criminals. So if a Chinese citizen commits a crime in the United States and leaves and gets back to China, China will not extradite. They won't send their citizen back to our country for punishment. So it's interesting how governments interact with one another. Why do authoritarian governments spy on their citizens and prevent them from immigrating? Remember, immigrating is to leave a country. Immigration is to enter a country. So some people confuse those two words. But I think it's important. If you understand then, our country is broken up into states. So each state has its own jurisdiction. Like if you commit a crime in California, California deals with that crime. If I commit a crime in the United States in California, but then I end up in Texas, states will extradite you back to the state of the original crime. It does get tricky if you commit a crime in California and in Texas. That can be an issue right there. So that's why the United States has formed the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, that has jurisdiction over the entire country, and state boundaries don't matter. The CIA doesn't have jurisdiction outside of the United States. So sometimes we do covert operation in countries with or without permission. That gets tricky. So if we have an operative in another country and they could be arrested, and that's where it gets really tricky. Did we get permission for our operatives to be in another country? And sometimes we work with other countries we're friends with, like say France or Great Britain. They might tell us, hey, we have some operatives in your country trying to take care of our citizens who happen to be living in your boundaries. And we do the same thing with our CIA. But sometimes we don't get permission, right? We send operatives into Pakistan to try to track down Osama bin Laden. And maybe when we find him, we don't tell Pakistan because we don't want them to tip him off. We just take care of our business. And some countries can say, hey, that's not cool, you doing that on our territory. And that can create international incidences, okay? And this, of course, dealing with jurisdiction and dealing with international crime and punishment. There are some international organizations like Interpol is an international police. Okay. And so Interpol sometimes will get involved if there's a citizen from one country committing a crime in another. So it's interesting. If you're following the law, then maybe this doesn't even affect your world. But there are different systems, even within the United States and internationally. If you commit a crime in California, are you going to end up in the state prison system or the federal prison system? Because it depends on which type of crime you commit. So there's county jails and there's state prison systems and also a federal prison system. What we're going to do is talk for a few minutes about some of the most powerful people on the planet Earth. Xi Jinping was elected as president of the People's Republic of China back in March 2013, and he's still in power. He is one of the most powerful people in the world. Why? Because China has the world's second biggest economy, but it has the world's biggest population by far. Okay, I say by far, India's close behind, but India's economy is not close to China. China has nuclear weapons, so does India. China is politically and culturally significant on the continent of Asia. India is as well, but China is more aggressive in its international diplomacy lately. I pulled this off the internet, and it changes all the time, but when I'm recording this in 2020, here's a look at how Forbes rates the most powerful people in the world. Now, again, this could change, and it has, but as of right now, they say that Xi Jinping is probably the most powerful person on the world. If you just look at sheer number of people that he controls and the fact that the government in China is a communist government, which has more control over its people than, say, a democratically elected republic in the United States. Xi Jinping is somebody that you've got to pay attention to and you've got to know. Xi Jinping. He's the president, the communist leader of the People's Republic of China, the world's biggest population and second biggest economy. Forbes says that Vladimir Putin is the second most powerful person on the planet Earth. He, of course, is the president of Russia, and he has been in control of Russia really since the end of the Cold War. There have been some other presidents, but everybody knows that Vladimir Putin has been the man since the end of the Cold War. There was like Boris Yeltsin, who kind of was a transitional president, but kind of fell on his face because of all the change and going from a communist to a sort of quasi-capitalistic / mafia run country of Russia. Vladimir Putin stepped in and restored order and has changed the constitution of Russia to allow him to remain president really for life. Okay, Vladimir Putin has been in power almost since the end of the Cold War in the 1990s. And of course, Russia has the world's most nuclear weapons and a huge army. And even though its economy is not as strong as China, of course, they're still seeing how significant that is. Now, Donald Trump is on number 3 because he is president of the United States in 2020 when I'm recording this. And of course, again, that's going to make this change. But the president of the United States, maybe not the most powerful person. We have the strongest economy. But the president is not as powerful. The president of the United States is not as powerful as, say, the president of Russia or China, just because of the way their government works. Remember, in our country, we purposely tried to divide the power of government up into 3 branches. And other countries don't always do that. And so our country might be strong and powerful, but the actual person who's president maybe doesn't have as much power as you might think. Okay? Remember that a president really has to get Congress to agree to what they're going to do. On this list is also, like, say, Angela Merkel, who is the chancellor of Germany, and that's the strongest economy in Europe. And then you get some people who aren't even presidents, but like just powerful because of their business, right? Like the guy who owns or runs Amazon is put on the number 5. So it's both rich as in business, but also power as in political power. And you kind of see this mixing of government and economics. And obviously, next semester we're going to get into economics. How do individual countries combat terrorist organizations that do not recognize international norms or boundaries? For instance, Colombia might feel like the boundaries of Colombia are what you see on a map, but there are certain political dissidents or breakoffs that are controlling parts of a country in Venezuela or Colombia, drug lords or even military, breakoffs. And so sometimes countries don't even control the population within their country. Nigeria is a great example of a country that's on a map. You can see the boundaries, but the central government of Nigeria might not control all of the territory within their country. And you know that there's been some terrorist attacks in the United States, but there's terrorist attacks that have happened over the last 45 years in Central America, assassinations, bombings, political killings. In South America, okay, especially Colombia has had some huge problems, okay? Nigeria, when you get this boundary between the Islamic North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, that's kind of more of a Christian culture, you get a huge clash and political assassinations and revolutions and paramilitary groups. Obviously, the Middle East has been the focus of a lot of the terrorist attacks and the focus of some of them initiating some of those attacks. But there's almost more terrorist attacks that happen in between India and Pakistan over the contested, like, say, Kashmir area, right? And you can see even like in places like Sri Lanka and in the Philippines. So terrorism is not just an American problem. And sometimes people don't recognize the government, and so they fight against that government. There are other things that challenge us in the world and that governments must deal with, and even international government organizations must deal with. Things like climate change. How can multinational alliances work together? Because if we're spewing out waste and pollution in the United States, it's going to affect Canada. So the rules for our companies in the United States, it's going to affect their air quality, right, and the environment. Okay, and if China says, "Hey, we're going to have factories that burn coal and belch out pollution into the atmosphere," and we say, "Hey, that's not fair," we can't really control China, but it's going to affect our quality of life. And so those are questions that have to be asked as we move forward, into the 21st century. Again, at the beginning of this lecture, we talked about different types of governments and how they work. And sometimes, say, if there's one person who's running the country, I might call it a monarchy, and somebody else might say, well, it's really a dictatorship. But really, it's just a rule by one. And there are some countries where we practice democracy, but it might be a republic. right? So there are different ways of how we organize people into a functioning civilization. Why do ordinary people risk their lives to flee from transform authoritarian states? It's because they're looking for a better life. Okay? And why do many artists and intellectuals defect to non authoritarian nations? We get a lot of people who move into our country from other ones escaping political problems because their governments aren't functioning. They're what we might call a failed state. Now, these are governments that aren't really functioning. There is a government, and they say that they're in charge, but a lot of other countries say you're not really even in control of your own country. A lot of the failed states we would find in the Middle East right now. Yemen is a mess. Syria has been a mess for a while. There's political fighting. Obviously, Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States has had troops in all three or four of these places, right? We've had some special forces troops in Syria, but not our entire military. We've been at war in Iraq twice. Once when I was in high school, and then once after this war on terrorism right after 9/11. Afghanistan, we've had troops in Afghanistan, and Yemen has been a huge humanitarian crisis in Yemen. There's several places in Africa that have had genocides and problems over the last few years, and that really needs to be acknowledged. Um, and of course, one of the most famous failed states in the Americas is Venezuela, that's just been imploding on itself, and inflation has been out of control. And so we don't want to leave on a bad note, but we want to just kind of acknowledge that we're here at the end of our class, and this is week 17 on comparative governments.